3 words on a handwritten note destroyed Emily's world. "I see you." Those words confirmed her worst fear. The shadowy figure from the cemetery was real, following her home and learning where she lived. A cold dread crept through her veins as the paper trembled in her hand. Tonight, we trace Emily's journey from denial to terror. You'll witness how her mind tried desperately to rationalize each new sign of danger, even as evidence mounted that someone was watching her every move. What did the stalker want? What was his motive? How did it lead to this event? Questions that will leave us deeply puzzled. Why would anyone find peace in a cemetery? For Emily, the question had a simple answer. It was the only place where silence truly meant silence. Growing up in a household before siblings and parents who fought more than they spoke, Emily had learned early that home wasn't always a sanctuary. The cemetery had become her refuge during her sophomore year of college, after her mother's diagnosis. The doctors had given her mother 6 months. Emily had taken a semester off, watching as the disease transformed the woman who once danced in the kitchen while making Sunday pancakes into a hollow shell who couldn't recognize her own daughter. In those months, Emily would slip away to OakWood Cemetery, finding an old bench beneath a sprawling elm tree where she could breathe. After her mother passed, the cemetery remained her sanctuary. The mathematics of gravestones, birth date, dash, date of passing, provided a strange comfort. Life was finite, measurable. Emily's anxieties diminished among these concrete reminders of mortality. For 3 years, she had visited weekly, sometimes reading, sometimes just existing in the silence. But tonight was different. The place that had once offered solace now seemed to harbor something sinister. As Emily walked a familiar path, her skin prickled with goosebumps despite the mild May evening. The cemetery's usual quiet felt distorted. Each crunch of gravel under her boots echoed unnaturally, as if there were other footsteps echoing hers. The distant call of an owl made her shoulders tense. She tried to dismiss the unease as residual anxiety from the true crime podcast she'd been listening to earlier. It had detailed the unsolved disappearances of 3 women from nearby towns in the 1980s. Emily tightened her jacket around her body, suddenly aware of how familiar gravestones cast unfamiliar shadows in the moonlight. It can't be such a big coincidence, right? That was years ago. The fog transformed the cemetery into something menacing. It curled around monuments like a living entity, obscuring the lower halves of angels and crosses. The marble Virgin Mary that Emily had always found peaceful now appeared to be weeping, moisture collecting on the downturned face. The earthy scent of moss and stone was now tainted with something vaguely metallic. Her heartbeat quickened as she approached her favorite bench. The back of her neck tingled with the distinct sensation of being watched. Emily turned quickly, scanning the rows of headstones. Nothing moved except the fog, drifting between tombstones like shadowy fingers. The sound came first, a soft brushing like fabric against stone, followed by a shadow that seemed to shift independently of the objects around it. Emily froze mid-step. Her mind raced for explanations. A small animal, a branch moving in the wind, but her body responded with primitive alarm. Her mouth went dry, pupils dilated, palms instantly slick with sweat. As she neared her bench, Emily noticed something unusual. A single white lily lay across the weathered wood, its petals luminous in the moonlight. In 3 years, she had never seen anyone at this specific spot. The flower looked freshly cut, its stem still beaded with water droplets. Someone had been here very recently. Someone who perhaps knew this was her place. The cemetery that had taught Emily to accept the passing on of humans was about to show her how desperately she wanted to live. There's a primal switch that flips in the human brain when survival is threatened, a mechanism as ancient as humanity itself, designed to prepare the body for immediate action when danger appears. For Emily, that switch flipped the moment she noticed a subtle shift in the darkness beneath the weathered oak tree. She'd been staring at the lily on her bench, fingertips hovering just above its pristine petals, when something in her peripheral vision changed. At first, her rational mind dismissed it. A branch swaying in the breeze, perhaps, or a small animal scurrying across fallen leaves. The mind's first offense is always denial. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the stillness of the cemetery. Yet beneath her conscious dismissal, her body began to register warning signals. A quickening pulse, a tightness in her chest, senses sharpening as adrenaline quietly seeped into her system. Emily stood motionless, eyes fixed on the spot where she detected movement. The seconds stretched as she strained to see through the darkness. Then it happened again, a definite shift in the shadows, more deliberate this time. A certainty crystallized within her. Someone was there. From behind the ancient oak emerged a figure, its features obscured by shadow and her distorted perception. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, like a spider across its web, each movement precise and predatory, a dark ballet performed with patient inevitability. The figure stood at the edge of the tree's shadow, observing her with an intensity she could feel like physical pressure against her skin. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet her body refused to obey. The disconnect between mind and muscle, that ancient psychological paralysis, kept her rooted to the spot despite her desperate desire to escape. Her thoughts raced while her limbs betrayed her. The figure took a step forward, and moonlight caught something in its hand, a metallic object that glinted coldly in the dim light. The mystery of what that object might be triggered a surge of terror that finally bridged the gap between thought and movement. She turned and ran, abandoning all thought of direction. The cemetery path, once so familiar, now seemed alien and treacherous. Gravestones that provided comfort now loomed as obstacles. The fog, a gentle mist when she arrived, thickened around her, distorting her perception. Emily's senses heightened painfully. Gravel crunched like breaking bones beneath her feet. Branches against her arm felt like real fingers. Behind her, footsteps followed, steady, unhurried, confident in their pursuit. She had seen what the metallic object was. The long, slender shape of a hunting knife, its blade polished to a mirror finish that reflected the cold moonlight. This wasn't a chance encounter with another cemetery visitor. This was a predator in her safe space. Her lungs burned as she sprinted toward the gates, their wrought iron promising safety beyond. She stumbled once, her palm scraping against the tombstone's rough edge as she caught herself. The pain drove her forward with renewed urgency. The footsteps behind her never quickened, maintaining their steady rhythm, as if her pursuer knew the inevitability of the outcome. Emily escaped the cemetery that night, but the true horror wasn't what she fled from. It was what followed her home. She realized that the danger was real and it had found her. The morning after her terrifying encounter, Emily stood under the shower's scalding spray, watching the cemetery's dirt swirl down the drain. As the hot water washed away the physical evidence, her mind began the more complicated task of washing away the truth. Perhaps the figure had been another cemetery visitor, startled by her presence. Maybe the metallic object had been a phone catching moonlight. The shadows and fog must have distorted her perception, transforming an innocent stranger into something sinister. It was nothing, she whispered to her reflection as she wiped steam from the bathroom mirror. The lie fell hollow even as she spoke it, but she repeated it like a mantra in the days that followed. Each repetition built another thin layer of protection between her consciousness and the truth her body had already registered. Emily's apartment transformed from a sanctuary into a battleground for her psychological struggle. She checked locks twice, drew curtains she'd never used before, and flinched at the scrape of branches against her window. Standing in her kitchen one evening, Emily froze with a mug halfway to her lips. "Will I ever feel normal again?" she whispered to the empty room, the question hanging in the air unanswered. Cognitive dissonance worked overtime as Emily struggled to reconcile what she experienced with what she could tolerate knowing. The mental conflict manifested physically, in sleepless nights, startling at ordinary sounds, and the constant anxiety that hung beneath her everyday activities. "You seem on edge," her roommate mentioned casually over breakfast. "Just stress about work," Emily replied, extending her denial to others. Acting normal became its own exhausting job, while a stalker's presence loomed over her. At night, her defenses weakened. Sleep brought snippets of memory her waking mind worked so hard to suppress. The rhythm of footsteps behind her, the cold gleam of metal, the certainty of being hunted. She'd wake gasping, sheets tangled around her legs, the nightmares increasingly vivid. During daylight, Emily forced herself back into routines. She attended classes and met friends, convincing herself that public places meant safety. But trauma had rewired her nervous system. A car door slamming made her flinch. A figure walking too close quickened her pace. Her phone became both comfort and weapon, 911 pre-dialed and ready. 2 weeks after the cemetery incident, the denial began crumbling. Something pulled Emily from sleep earlier than usual. An unsettling awareness drew her to the window. Looking down, she saw them, footprints in the morning dew, leading directly to her apartment window. Not random patterns, but deliberate tracks that stopped precisely beneath her bedroom window. She stared at those impressions in the grass, her explanations dissolving. These weren't paranoid imaginings. This was evidence. Someone had stood there, watching her most vulnerable moments. The realization sent ice through her veins. That evening, Emily checked every closet, tested every lock, and moved her dresser in front of her bedroom door. She slept with a kitchen knife under her pillow. The comfort of denial had been a thin blanket indeed, one that could no longer shield her from the growing cold of reality. The barrier between denial and acceptance is often not a gradual slope, but a steep cliff. As Emily's fingers trembled around the small folded note that had appeared beneath her door, she stood on her toes, unaware that reading those 3 simple words would send her plummeting into a reality far more terrifying than her nightmares. For weeks, Emily's mind had been constructing a psychological fortress against mounting evidence. The footprints in the morning dew, the figure behind the oak tree at the cemetery, the moonlight glinting off metal. Each incident had created hairline fractures in her defenses, but she'd managed to patch them with rational explanations and self-reassurance. The paper in her hand was ordinary, a torn scrap from a notebook, but the message shattered everything. "I see you." Her body responded instantly, stomach contracting as though she'd been punched, face draining of color, heart hammering against her ribs with such force she could feel each beat in her fingertips. The note fluttered to the floor as her hands went numb. In that moment, her psychological fortress crumbled completely. Someone had been here. Someone had touched her door, crouched down, and violated the sanctuary of her home. The reality she'd been denying crystallized with merciless clarity. That night at the cemetery had been real, and so was this. Emily backed away from the note. Her living room transformed before her eyes. Windows became transparent invitations for watching eyes. Corners darkened into potential hiding places. The entire space turned from shelter to exposure. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze darted frantically around the room. Who had been watching her while she ate dinner alone? Read on the couch? Change clothes in her bedroom? The violations multiplied in her mind, each more invasive than the last. She lunged for her phone, calling Katie, then her brother, then her neighbor. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. The universe had abandoned her to her fear. Moving with frantic energy, Emily transformed her apartment into a fortress, engaging every lock, drawing every blind, switching on every light. She dragged a chair against the front door, wedging it under the handle. These measures were likely inadequate. Someone had already breached her security once. But the primitive need for protection overrode logic. In the bathroom mirror, a stranger stared back at her, shadowed eyes and a pallid face, haunted and unrecognizable. The truth crashed through her. Nowhere was safe. Not the cemetery where she had once found peace. Not this apartment where she had tried to heal. Her walls weren't protection. They were a cage. Emily forced herself to pick up the note again, feeling its texture between her trembling fingers. The edge wasn't cleanly torn but jagged, as if ripped hastily from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was deliberately average. Most disturbing was what she hadn't noticed before, a small smudge in the corner, a partial thumbprint, physical evidence of her watcher, proof of their existence beyond her fear. Then she remembered the security camera in the hallway, the cheap model installed after last year's package theft. It only stored footage for 48 hours, but it might have captured something. The note couldn't have been there long. She'd only been in her bedroom for 2 hours. For the first time since seeing those 3 words, Emily felt a spark of purpose cutting through her fear. The security camera footage struck like a thunderbolt, revealing her stalker was none other than her neighbor's son. This wasn't a stranger, but someone she'd exchanged pleasantries with countless times. His familiar face now transformed into something sinister. In an instant, the ordinary became horrifying as Emily realized he had been hiding in plain sight all along, meticulously observing her routines while masquerading as just another friendly face. Her story stands as a chilling reminder to trust our instincts. That night in the cemetery, Emily's body had sounded the alarm, racing heart, constricted chest, overwhelming urge to flee. Physical warnings her conscious mind dismissed too readily. "I always thought danger would announce itself," Emily later confessed. Instead, it lived next door. The true horror was never supernatural. It was a human predator hiding within the comfort of everyday life, transforming her sanctuary into a trap.